Good afternoon. Welcome to the third episode of Cineclub Película. This week we are discussing the film El Sur by Víctor Erice. Joining us in this episode are filmmaker Baby Ruth Villarama, best known for Sunday Beauty Queens and Jazz in Love. Baby Ruth.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting.
Thank you for joining us. Also with us is Richard Bolisay, film critic and educator from the UP Film Institute and author of Break It to Me Gently, his collection of film criticism. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Jessica. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see all of you and to be here.
Yes. And then finally, joining us from Madrid, just back from her vacation, filmmaker Sally Gutierrez, whose most recent film is the documentary Do You Remember the Philippines? About language, memory, and the relationship between the Philippines and Spain. Hello, Sally.
Good morning. It's still the morning here. Buenos dias. It's 11 a.m. here, and I'm very happy to join you from what was my grandfather painter's studio and now is my home and studio. And many Philippine filmmakers and intellectuals have been here. So, hello, Philippines.
Yes, and interesting because we're talking about the South, El Sur, and it turns out that Sally's grandfather had a special relationship with the South. So we are talking about El Sur by Víctor Erice, and I should be eternally grateful to Clásicos, Contigo, because it has introduced me to the films of this wonderful filmmaker who is now 80 and has made only 3 films. So, you know, there's still time. But then, even as I join the ranks of admirers who wish he had made more than 3 films, I wonder if 3 is enough because they're all perfect. So now there's this lingering fear that maybe if he made more movies, they would not be as perfect as they are now. But anyway, we know that, I know that his first film, his debut was The Spirit of the Beehive, made in 1973. El Sur, which we are discussing today, came out in 1983. And then his documentary, The Quince Tree Sun, came out in the 90s. So as Richard pointed out to me, that's 1 film per decade. But first, I'd like to ask Sally for a little context about Víctor Erice. What is his reputation at home? Because we know of prominent Filipino filmmakers who are actually better known abroad than they are in the Philippines. But what is the reputation of Víctor Erice in Spain?
Well, I could talk a long time about Víctor Erice and his reputation. Although I'm actually come from the visual arts, I'm not an filmmaker. But Víctor Erice, to begin with, has a very cult status here. He's very, very recognized. He's taught in film schools, and he's one of the most important filmmakers, not only in Spain, but also in the world. But on the other hand, and he also belongs to that kind of school of nuevos cineastas españoles. They were new in the 70s, who were working under the dictatorship, but were making films that in some way were questioning and in opposition to the dictatorship, but under the rules so that they could be seen. And,
yes, and you made a point about the different time frames involved in our watching El
So
Sur.
Víctor Erice, on the one hand, he's a cult filmmaker. He's very well known, very well recognized. But on the other hand, a friend of mine, my DOP, who shot my film, we were discussing this film a few days ago, and she was telling me how he was a filmmaker who had huge problems with the industry and with producers because he was so meticulous, so careful, and so challenging that many producers didn't want to work with him. So, you know, from us as visual artists, as filmmakers, we recognize him, but he was actually kind of like, not exactly banished, but he had a very difficult relationship with the film industry. So that's important to know. And because Raquel reminded me of this. And I just wanted to mention, without going into a long historical explanation, that I find it's really interesting, and I think it really links with you in the Philippines, like these three moments that were two moments, and then the now that Víctor Erice relates to in the film, connects to. One would be the time of the story, the diegetic time, which is this kind of second part of the dictatorship, which started in 1956, which after the dark period of the post-war and the civil war Spain, you know, which we think extreme poverty exactly, suddenly President Eisenhower in the US, because they had a strategic interest in having a military bases in Spain, Eisenhower visits Madrid and recognizes Franco, and Franco says this famous sentence, "I have finally won the civil war," because Spain is recognized. And there's even a moment in the film when the maid Casella is singing that song about llega la televisión, like that idea of the economic prosperity, Spain becoming a country that's recognized in the rest of the world. And I think it's not a coincidence that Erice is still talking about how we cannot forget and how trying to forget, which would be the second part, which is when the film comes out, which is 1983.
1983, yes.
And 1983, if the so-called Spanish transition starts in 1976, we have to remember
with the death
that
of
the so-called Spanish transition was planned by the forces that was still at the end of the dictatorship in Spain. And they planned that kind of peaceful, so-called modelic transition. But the price of that
where they all agreed just not to talk about
exactly that was el pacto de amnistía, the pact of silence, which we forget, the human rights violations, all of the deaths, etc. And that would be that second moment in the film, in when the film comes out, which is 1983, would be already the end of the transition, but it's part of it. And for me, that film, Erice is completely talking about memory, exile, and questioning all of that part of history. And just before I forget to link with that, I totally recommend that you watch a film, if you haven't, you and all of those who are taking part, which would link with El Sur, which is a documentary made by two friends of ours, which is now in Netflix, The Silence of the Others, El Silencio de los Otros, which won the Goya last year, it is exactly about this idea of the la memoria histórica, the memory of all of those who died or were tortured or human rights violations under the dictatorship. And the third moment would be the now, which we have a progressive government in Spain, which it was very, very difficult to get to this moment. And just a few months after they came into power, we have the pandemic, so they've had to deal with huge, very, very aggressive opposition. And suddenly this film is once more talking about those two Spains, no, and that anger, the rage, the aggression, and all of the waves of this neo-fascism that is going all through all of our world. So the film is incredibly current once more today. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yes, and later I'd like to talk about parallels between Spain and the Philippines as reflected in El Sur. Mm-hmm. And then, Richard, you have mentioned that The Spirit of the Beehive is a movie that changed your life. How did you discover Víctor Erice?
Yeah, I I saw Spirit of the Beehive when I was in college, and it was not through the university. It was just by curiosity, and I picked it up in Video 48, which
Yes.
unfortunately had closed down recently. But it was one of those films that really introduced me to a different kind of language, to a different way of filmmaking process, or telling stories about trauma and childhood. And I just noted here that whereas one of the most famous stories surrounding the Spirit of the Beehive was that the DOP of the film, Luis Cuadrado, was almost blind during
Exactly.
filming.
Mhm.
With
And
El
yet the
Sur,
cinematography
with
is spectacular.
yes, wonderful. One of the best aspects of the film. With El Sur, when you read the reviews, what's always mentioned is it's being an unfinished film. You know how the
Yes.
producer Elias Carejeta, halted the production of the film because he felt that what Erice produced was already enough, for a feature film. And I
Exactly.
think that
So
that kind of dynamic really informed the kind of reputation El Sur has, which for me, as someone who didn't live in Spain and didn't know anything about it, gave it quite a different subtlety as opposed to the previous film, which is widely regarded as a great film. With this
yes.
one, it kind of gives you an impression that it's an imperfect film. There's something that
Mhm.
could have been done more to it. But, personally as it is, I think it already created something, a huge impact on me when I saw it.
Yes. And so Richard has brought up the fact that El Sur is actually Erice's incomplete film. In fact, he has referred to it as his incomplete film because the intention was to make a 2.5-hour movie based on the novela El Sur by Adelaida Garcia Morales, whom Erice was married to at the time. So they were filming, and then his famous producer decided that the film would end the way it did, with Estrella, the protagonist, packing for her trip to the south, while the novella continues with her eventual trip to the south. So I'd like to ask Baby Ruth, as a filmmaker who I'm sure has had much experience with our local producers, has this happened to your knowledge in the Philippines, where the producer just steps in and says, "Okay, you've shot enough. That's it. That's the end. You're going to have to cut that together." Baby
Oh
Ruth?
my God, Jessica, a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a natural relationship between directors and producer to fight over scenes and over length of films. I remember helping with with the film of Love Diaz in terms of its distribution here in the Philippines, the
Yes.
Panahon ng Halimaw, English title of Seasons of the Devil. And I remember the producer asked Direct Love Diaz if he can cut the film less because, to save cinema time and to
Yes.
get another hours in the cinema.
But of course, the
And I can,
context is some of Love Diaz's movies are 11 hours long. So I do feel some sympathy for the producer.
so there's two schools of thought. Like producers always think about the audience, and of course the directors, stand on their artistic side. Like for me as a director, um, I I have to feel it. When I feel that the film has come full circle already, and it has ended the way it should. Especially when you're shooting documentary films, it takes time to create it. And when the producer tells you that you have to finish it, it for me, it's the director's call because you've spent more time with your characters, with your subjects, and you know the story by heart. So we've experienced that. That's why there's always the director's cut, in some
Yes.
films, because some directors are really passionate and strong-willed to allow their version of the film to be seen by the audience. So with this Del Sur, I watched it at 3 o'clock in the morning. I thought that I was watching two films at the same time, and the
Mhm.
more interesting part of it is that the things are unsaid, the myths, and the imagination that's being given to you as a viewer, and I want to know more. But it's also interesting to note that the film won a Palme d'Or in Cannes and all those recognitions. So you kind of reflect like, maybe that's a good call by the producer. But of course, as an audience, you feel forfeited because you want to know more about what happens next. Did the character eventually figure out who the telephone number belongs to, and all sorts of questions that left us asking for more.
Yeah, so it's a delicious memory that we can spend decades dissecting. What if the movie had been a complete adaptation of the novella and so on? What might have happened? Would it have been better? Would it have been not as good? But I'd like to ask all of you for your impressions of the film, as in particular elements that stand out for you. Shall we start with Sally?
Yes, I just wanted to, picking up with what Baby Ruth said, which I found really interesting. I'm really looking forward to watching your films. I've seen a lot of films of the Philippines, but I think I haven't seen yours. And I hope you can all watch Do You Remember the Philippines? There's this sentence that is in the beginning of the book, which is a quote by poet Hölderlin, which Adelaide Garcia Morales is super interesting, also cult writer who spent some years in Granada, Las Alpujarras, and she was also had that fascination with the South. She wrote in the beginning of the book, "What can we love that is not a shadow?" She quotes Hölderlin, and I think it's really interesting how, Richard, you were talking about Luis Cuadrado. Luis Cuadrado is another super cult, very studied, but also kind of not as recognized as he should be, DOP. And as you were saying, when he worked also in El Sur, he was already going blind. And I think there's so many levels in that film there's so many levels of loss and of mystery, that the loss of the South, of the lover, of the the loss of freedom, and also even more us as filmmakers or artists or writers, like the loss of seeing of the DOP. I mean, it's so incredible, and how he works with this idea of light and shadow. And Erice is a total intellectual. He knows a lot about painting, as we know from his last film. And for me, I'm constantly seeing Vermeer, Caravaggio, like different Spanish manierist painters in many of his shots. I mean, they're very, very studied. There's this constant Estrella coming out of the darkness in her white nightie, picking up her puppy and bringing it towards her, and then we go from the darkness to the light, or the moment when she sees her father.
Especially the scene in the First Communion where the father is standing at the back of the church, so she walks towards the back of the church. Then he comes out of the darkness.
Incredible.
The darkness looks almost liquid.
Incredible. All of that. I mean, the work of lightness and dark and contrast, and the work of this director of photography is amazing. As Baby Ruth was saying, there's so much that you don't need words for. The words are there. When she says, you can stay there if you want, you can go out if you need to, because she realizes with that intuition of a child how hard for him it is for him to be inside of a church, what the church represented in Franco Spain, what the church represented for our friend Carlos Celdran, who was in exile and who was in the studio. No?
Yes.
And suddenly that same figure, and that girl, the little girl, realizes and says, you can go outside if you want, but make sure you are here. So like that being here in darkness, being there, even if the film cannot see you, talking about the diegetic, but also the extra diegetic presence of the father is amazing. That one sentence, no? Quédate, even if I can't see, which is talking about everything that's outside of the film, happening in Spain, happening in the Philippines, happening for every person who watches a film whose country has been through a dictatorship or through any political regime. So there's so much that is said through the language of film, through the language of art, through the language of art. And that's for me one of the things of Víctor Erice. Víctor Erice realizes that art is a way that we work with images, we work with words, we work with poetry, and we don't have to over-explain because there's a language that's talking for us, that's there. So there's this constant play of absence and presence in so many of the scenes. And this is that other moment for me when she sees him going into that cafe, that typical Spanish beautiful cafe. They have them in every city, and she sees that he's writing a letter. Now, I'm working now on my thesis about letters in film, films that are based on letters. And that moment when he's writing a letter, where we know the letter that he's writing, but she doesn't know. So we're on both sides, no? We are with him, but we're with the girl. Suddenly we are pushed from being the little girl who knows, who's discovering about her father, to this privileged position that in some way we're even, I don't know if you.
We know something that she doesn't.
Yeah, and then suddenly, boom, they're outside and we're inside. For me, that moment is what we say magistral. No? Suddenly we're inside with the letter, and we're looking at that scene of the two of them, which is absolutely painterly, but it's full of metaphors. Obviously, a lot has been written about the scene of where she dances with the father, the first dance, the second tango. But for me, there's that one scene of the windows, and the other scene when they're dressing her, and they're repeating all that, marvelous Julia. They're repeating all the time this idea of the bride. Huh? You look
the
like
bride.
a bride. Huh? I mean,
and later there is a wedding party.
Yeah, but it's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that Víctor Erice is also talking about how in some way Estrella is a continuation of Irene Rios. It's something almost incestuous about the father was in love with that woman, and now he's in love with his daughter. And I would also like, if we have time, would like to talk about the figure of the wife, who I really like.
Yes.
And I find that she's a I don't know. It's a very, for me, it's very, from a feminist point of view, it's a very problematic, that the figure of the wife. But anyway, that moment where she runs away, she's dressed as a bride, but she runs away from all of those women that are fussing over her because she's looking for the father, and she runs outside and she sees her father shooting, and she hears him. For me, that's also says everything. That one scene without words says everything.
Yes. And so in the films of Víctor Erice, we see an excellent explanation of how literary language and cinematic language are two completely different languages. And by the way, I forgot to tell our viewers that if they would like to ask any questions of our guests, to please post your questions on chat. Now, Sally was talking about how so much is expressed in images and so little is said outright. And one of the things that stuck out for me was when the old nanny of the father comes to visit, and in a few words she dispenses with the Civil War and its aftermath. Completely. By explaining to Estrella, well, in a war, you win or you lose, and then the winners decide who gets to speak, the losers have to be quiet, and it's great how it doesn't go into sermons or lectures, but everything is contained in that very small, lovely scene. And Richard, I'm sure we have a lot to unpack, but what is it about El Sur that really moves you?
Yeah, Baby Ruth and Sally raised really important points, which I'd like to pick up from. So,
yes.
I think length or running time is a political issue. No, it's not just about how long the film is. So I often ask my students, where did we get the idea that the film should be contained in 2 hours or 1 hour or 1.5 hours? So I think in this case, if Erice is really pushing for a longer film, I think it's also a display of resisting conventions in the idea of Hollywood doing this 2-hour films and making them very palatable and digestible to mass audiences. And I think El Sur is able to really make you feel as though complete, but also lacking. So Erice is playing with this kind of duality in the sense that it's giving you a complete experience, but it's also urging you to ask questions. What's it about? What are these enigmas I'm experiencing? And I spoke about duality because, in a sense, one of my favorite shots in the film is in the beginning when it was dark and you see the credits, but second after second, you see a window manifesting on the right side slowly, and you see the curtain moving and you see the light moving in. And there's a lot of windows in the film. as though it's talking about the internal and the external sides of lives, of
The
souls, of
external
bodies,
coming in. Yeah.
yeah, coming in. And like sometimes, I mean, most of the time with the characters, even though she's in places and places are considered external, you kind of feel that these places also mirror her internal life, how what she thinks, her inner life. And I think there's something about that moves me, how the film is able to transport me into her mind, into what she
The
thinks.
interiority
Even,
of it all, yes.
yeah, and Sally was right about pointing out the striking images. And even with the spirit of the beehive, you really notice that how he uses shadows, how he uses chiaroscuro to to show this differences between the father and the daughter. And I really I really like that a lot. And I wrote here it's visual, it's literary, it's musical, it's cinematic, it's political, and there's a lot of layers to it that by watching it you don't really feel overwhelmed, but you feel as though it's unfolding in front of you slowly. I also I also like the characters in the sense that it mirrors the political situation of the time, in the sense that they're intimidated into silence. Like
Yes.
they just don't they do not speak, not because they have nothing to say. That's why I also often tell my students that textual analysis is not sufficient. You just don't watch a film and analyze what you see in the text. You have to understand why the characters are intimidated into silence. Why are they not talking? And as the film unfolds, you kind of understand, why the father is not opening up, why the daughter is very curious about her father, why she stalks him, why for me, like, the most moving part of the film, if I have to answer it, is the conversation in the end. It's not the most visual part of the film, but for me it's somehow gratifies. It didn't answer all the questions, but it provides you that kind of tenderness between them, the relationship between them, that they were able to communicate, that she was able to ask him who that Irene Rios was.
Irene
And
Rios,
I
yes.
think, yeah. And I think more than the answer, it's more of raising the question to him, and seeing his face kind of gives you already the idea of that trauma that the film is exploring.
Yes.
In Spirit of the Beehive, it's Anna's trauma, in the end. But here you see it's generational. The father, the daughter, and maybe the next generation even. It really explores that a lot, I think.
Yes. And so this is my first time to watch El Sur. And usually when I see a film that I really like, I want to watch it over and over again. But this is different because after watching it, I feel that I have to let time pass because there is so much to unpack that I'm not sure what its final impact on me is. But obviously, this is a film that I'm going to see again and again. And so before we move on to Sally's reaction to what Richard said, Baby Ruth, what exactly struck you about El Sur?
Well, personally, I really appreciate the use of symbiosis to all characters. For me, it's an out of the box coming of age film that challenges conventions in so many levels. Maybe what I'm about to say, would be almost scandal, when it comes to how the director and the film challenges the conventions of religion in suppressing, the real feelings of people and the curiosity of people to build authentic relationship and to discuss difficult situations. And I'm fascinated with the character of Julia, in particular the mother, and the use of the women in the film.
Exactly. Yeah.
Milagros, Doña Rosario, and Casilda.
Casilda.
They belong to that conventional institution. That you as a woman, should just be in this box. And I remember that scene in the staircase when Australia was so curious to go up in the attic, and
Yes,
Julia was
and her
just,
mother said, "Oh, it's your father's powers."
yes, and if you
Yeah.
notice in the entire film, Julia never really entered the attic, or they're together but they're living in two separate realms. So you can understand how hypocrite marriage is in that sense. So I like how the film challenges all this hypocrisy, but very very subtle and very very mundane. Um, and yeah, so those are things that I remember and I want to watch it again. Yeah, you're right, you have to give it time to sort of simmer it a bit, and it's haunting because there's so many questions unanswered
Exactly.
in the film.
Yes, and you brought up the relationship between the father and mother, which reminds me again of the relationship of the married couple in The Spirit of the Beehive, where they do not seem like a happy couple. And Sally earlier had brought up, the portrayal of Julia, the mother, and how there are problems in it. Sally, would you like to go into that?
Yes, because to begin with, it's really interesting because Julia is a very, very interesting figure. There's a whole series of school teachers, maestras de la República, school teachers, who suffered the consequences, the purges, the reprisals of the dictatorship. You probably heard about the 13 Roses, the 13 Rosas, you've heard about. There are many films about them, Las Maestras de la República, a fantastic documentary also made by a woman filmmaker. So Julia is a very strong figure. She's not just a housewife, she's an intellectual. She was also persecuted.
Exactly.
And she's portrayed reading, looking after her plants, storing furniture. So you don't see her like washing up or cooking. There's no cooking. She's really interesting. But still, it's interesting how in this film, sometimes in some ways, it reminds me of these societies in which the men are absent because the men have gone to war, or the men have been imprisoned, or the men have been killed, and it's the women who es como la guerra de los hombres, no? The men in some way have disappeared, or even if Agustin is there, he's absent. The little girl once says, that since that moment the daddy ran away from home, things have changed. So, and she says, he didn't run away. She says, yes, he did. And we both know that he ran away. And that's also very powerful. Metaphorically, he's still here, but we know from that moment that he's not here anymore. So it's the women, the wonderful Casilda and the caretaker at home, the mother, the grandmother, who are talking, who are making the film, this community of women, sometimes in their place and sometimes outside their box, as you were saying, Baby Ruth. So I was wondering to myself, like, up to what point is this a feminist film or not? Like, it's really interesting, that duality. And Jessica, when you were talking about watching the film a couple of times, and then I want to say a quick comment about what Richard was saying of the last scene. I watched it 20 years ago. I mean, I watched it when I came out, and we were very young, just starting university, and it was a really important film for us that we talked about. We watched it in small independent film houses. And it's funny because in that moment, I remember being fascinated by the film, talking about how political it was, what you were saying, Richard, how it's poetic, but also very, very political in that way, that it talks so much about what is said and what cannot be said, and about those traumas. But watching it again these last days, it hasn't lost its magic. Sometimes when you reread a book or you re-watch a film, you're saying, oh no, I shouldn't have done it again, because I prefer to keep the memory of how powerful it was. But I have to say, and this might sound really bad, but in some way, suddenly, as you know, Agustin kind of irritated me. I understood him, but suddenly I was much more, maybe when I was in my 20s, I identified, I was beginning to be a feminist, but maybe, I hadn't been to Berlin. I had all my feminist education hadn't really developed. And suddenly now I was identifying much more without identifying with anybody, but suddenly I was feeling for that wife, and that guy was irritating me. Like, why are you here and there? Like, why are you destroying everybody's life around you? All these women's film, your wife,
Exactly.
your mother, and your first wife. You're destroying everybody's film with your cult. mythical figure, and suddenly I've seen it from a very different perspective. And yes, he's amazing. He's a Saori, he can tell where there's water, but there's also this myth of masculinity, and women are all around him. And in a way, I like it when Estrella is suddenly 15. And so going back to what you were commenting, Richard, for me, I agree, but I also disagree with you about that scene, because I think there's something, I think it's really clever of you, and you can tell that you must be a very good film teacher when you say it's more important that she asks than that he answers. But it's also very important that he doesn't answer, because it's what irritates her, and what's makes her stand up and go, can't you even now tell me the truth? We all know. Like, why do you still do those typical male games? Sorry, I'm sure not all males do them, but that thing of like, I answer you and you answer me with a little joke. Me vas a regañar, you're going to tell me off for drinking, blah, blah, blah. And it's always a joke, like language. No, stop. I want the answer. I'm old enough.
Yes.
And it's still in that dynamic of treating her kind of in this flirtatious, dishonest way. And she gets up and goes. I'm not skipping my French class. You've seduced enough women. I'm not skipping my French class for you. I'm going to be educated. So
yes,
in a way,
that's a great point. Yeah.
In a way, so there's that part of the missing. There's always something missing in the film. I mean, half of the film is missing. There's missing
exactly.
where Víctor Erice wanted the protagonist to. And that's why Víctor Erice always, when he presented the film, he was always angry, and he was always talking about the second part, because in that second part is where she confronts that past and meets her half-brother, meets this woman, gives him the péndulo. So this circle of trauma, because I was reading the other day that there's somebody wrote a paper talking about the inheritance of trauma, what you were saying about, and how Erice in some way works with that, by allowing Estrella to work through that trauma in that journey to the south. So it's really interesting.
And yet, in the incomplete film.
Yeah, it's the history of our country. A friend of mine, Carlos Hay, is a great artist, did a series where he called Spain Spain. Spain. Okay, I'm going to type it in the chat so everybody can read it. Spain. Okay, and that's, in a way, for me, it's really painful, because because once more, like the financial, whatever, political circumstances, the producer, even if the film is wonderful as it is, and even we're not going to start, as you were saying, Jessica, we don't need to have seen the second part, but still there's that part of reconciliation is not in the film. So yes, I love that scene, Richard. But for me, there's something irritating about the fact that that Agustin never answers.
Yeah. Sally has made a wonderful point that in this film, the father is almost godlike, in that he's the son around whom everyone's life rotates. Everyone is supposed to be quiet and leave him alone while he is exercising his powers, whatever they are. And he's seen as this perfect creature. And yet, it is only his daughter who initially adores him, who later has the guts to defy him. Richard, can we go more into Estrella, the character of Estrella, and her relationship with her father?
Yeah, I think as opposed to the other characters, Estrella is obviously the more curious one. No? The father has turned into a myth. And the film, for me, has explored this father issues that, is not only contained in the family setting. Even in our country, in the Philippines, we have father issues. We call our president father, and it's not a good thing. It's somehow the effect of patriarchy on our society really, has an effect on every aspect of our lives. And I agree with Sally with what she said. I think if I see this years later, decades later, there will be that kind of shift in my, understanding of it in a way, because I will never be able to understand how a woman, would feel and should feel. And I totally get that. And I think it's important that these discussions are going. We're making these discussions because we're able to illuminate on these issues that not many people understand. But like what I said earlier, it's really quite a cop out in the end, because after that conversation he died. There's that kind of
Yes.
dramatic
So
device.
everything is, as we say in the Philippines, bipin.
Yeah,
it's her fault
and that.
again.
Yeah, and he got away with it in a way.
Yeah, exactly. She
He
feels she
escaped.
takes guilt. She has guilt. Yeah, Estrella
Yeah,
has to work.
yeah.
with that.
He wasn't made accountable,
Exactly.
for what he did, and the burden was on Estrella herself. And perhaps that's what I wanted to see. Had it been a longer film, had Erice been able to make that second half, I would be able to understand it better. But there's this big deviation from the novel in the film, in the sense that they made the father a doctor. In the
Yes.
book, he's a teacher. He's a language teacher, and I think that that makes a lot of difference, in the sense that the father was doing this divine occult thing, with the pendulum. Like there's this contrast with science and occult, and
Yes.
I think that says a lot about society.
So as Sally pointed out, basically what the father does to all the women in the household is repeated by what the producer did to the movie, in that everyone is deprived of any sort of closure or certainty. But let's go to Baby Ruth, and how do you feel about the portrayal of the father and the daughter and his relationship, the relationships with the women in the household?
Well, obviously, Australia is the pointer of the audience in this film, because Australia has both access to, what the film is telling and what the film is not saying, and the search for truth. Because the character of Don Agustin only knows what's happening inside him, and whom he thought, he's the only person who knows the truth. But then there's Australia, whom, we've known all along, that she's been discovering the cracks in Don Agustin's character and his journey in the story. So the relationship is, is parallel but intersecting in the opposite direction. And then towards the end, you think that, they're beginning to connect. But then Australia goes back to the convention because he wants to pursue his education. He doesn't want to break the rule. But then Don Agustin realized, like, okay, when he realized that Australia is discovering, she knows the truth about, Irea and the letter, I feel that that's Don Agustin's last hope to reach out to his daughter and probably discuss about the truth. But then Australia chose, no, I'm going to my class. And then it just, ended like that abruptly. It's sad for me because the film portrayed Don Agustin superficially as a strong character, who has superpower. But in truth, he cannot grasp his true love. We don't know what that Irea and that Laura represent in his life. But it seems like, that's his inner desire. In truth, as a character, and because he's a prison of his own, I guess, limitation. Then he just ended it as that. So I mean, for me, it's very abrupt, and it's a sad thing. And of course, it's also an interesting way to look at suicide and to look at mental illness,
depression, yes,
about unprocessed feelings, because we're so trapped in this in the rules of life, mandated by women, and at least in the film.
Exactly. And another thing that I noticed, a similarity between The Spirit of the Beehive and The South, is the movie within the movie. In The Spirit of the Beehive, it was the movie James Whaley's Frankenstein, and here it was, of course, there is a movie within a movie where the father rediscovers Irene Rios. But then there is also that poster on the wall
Yeah.
of Alfred Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, which if you are a Hitchcock stan, is about a niece who adores her uncle, who they even have the same name, Charlie, and then she realizes that her uncle is not the man that she thought he was. And it's interesting because I found the novella by Adelaida Garcia Morales. It's available in an English translation on archive.org if anybody wants to look it up. And I found similarities. I found similarities to another Hitchcock film, which is Rebecca, in which the mystery of this woman whose identity she tries to construct, who turns out to be the woman in the South. And then later on in the movie, there's the shadow of the doubt, the shadow of a doubt. So to film nerds, that's just another attraction. But I'd like to ask Sally, since her family has links to the South that Estrella is so obsessed by. Tell us about your grandfather, the Republican.
Yeah, I was telling you that this film is really important for me, and I was really happy when Jose Fons invited me to talk about this film, because as I was telling you, it was a kind of coming age film when I was studying art in Madrid, and we were talking a lot about politics and the famous transition, and suddenly this film comes out, and also the author, who's this very also cult, enigmatic, mysterious, interesting figure, Adelaida Garcia Morales. I lived 8 years in Berlin and 4 years in New York, and when I came back, I moved into the studio where I'm living now. This was my grandfather's studio, Manuel Gutierrez Navas, who was a left-wing scriptwriter, painter, and an intellectual, who my father and his siblings lived in pretty much in poverty in the post-war, because as my grandfather had been a progressive thinker, it was pretty complicated for him. Although in the latter years, he became very religious and completely moved away from politics. And it's interesting because as I was telling you before we started, I've been going to the Philippines for many years, and I've made several video installations and short films, and I have several friends I'd like to, and many of them have been here to the studio. Marjorie Evasco, your great poet, Sid Hildawa, poet,
Carlos Celdran,
Christopher Ardeña, and last but not least, Carlos Celdran, who's one of the protagonists of my last film, and who became a great friend of mine when he was here in exile, because I helped him a lot. I supported him. He was a friend. He was in exile, and he actually rehearsed Living La Life Imella here in my studio. And in October, just when he passed, we were going to do a series of runnings of the film here. So I think it's really interesting how this space, which is a century old, and that links with that idea of Spain, also links to the Philippines. And my grandfather was from Seville. He moved here to study with painter Cecilio Pla, but he always loved the South, and he always loved Seville. And my sisters, there's lots of us, and they love the North. They love Asturias. They go to Asturias a lot. But I have this absolute passion for Andalusia, this beautiful village called Conil that I invite you to know, and to Seville. I have many good friends in Seville. I still have some family there. And
yes, and while in the film, Estrella is very much interested in the South, but in the novella, Sevilla specifically is mentioned.
Exactly. And when my husband and I were going through all of the books that my grandfather had he used to, at night when everybody was sleeping, he used to paste things and cut things out, and there was a whole cupboard full of books. And actually my aunt, who was a painter, had once said that my grandfather could have been shot because of during the dictatorship, because of the books he had here. But as Borges said, the best way of hiding a book is in a library. So amidst a lot of papers and newspapers, a lot of those publications come out, and we found this album that I'd like to show you briefly. Wait, I have to take my headphones off.
An album much like the one that appeared in El Sur.
Yeah.
Postcards. lovely.
Switch to gallery. Oh, wow.
So that amazing book is full of that nostalgia, because my grandfather actually worked as a designer for the famous Exposición Universal. You see the photographs there.
Which was in Sevilla, yes.
Which was in Sevilla. And also, it's important to remember, as Jose was reminding us, that many of the viewers don't realize that Seville was one of the bastions of the dictatorship. So if you were a Republic intellectual, you could not go back to Seville. Seville wasn't a place that you could go back to. That's why they talk about in the beginning of the film that the family was moving around for a long time. Of course,
suddenly they left the south and
they left the south. They were escaping.
Desolate place.
They were in exile inside their country until they reached a place where they weren't going to be persecuted. And that was the reality for many of intellectuals, as we know, went to Latin America, to different places, and also inside Spain, or interior exile. So that idea, the nostalgia for Seville is not only the nostalgia for the south, the weather, the palm trees, that way of life, which is very different from the north, but also the nostalgia for a place that you can't go back to. No? And although I don't like the readings, the articles that I've read talking about our friend Carlos and the fact that exile broke his heart, I don't think that's true. I think he was really happy in Madrid, and I think he actually
exactly I can vouch for that.
Wanted to build something new here. And I do think that the years in which, because he had, we all know his life, he had questioned the church, he had questioned the government, all of those years of the suffering that you have physically and mentally when you're an activist, that in some way did finish with his health and his life.
Yes.
So for me, there are many links between this space and my history, my relationship with the Philippines, and especially in the end, I suppose that we're always talking about life and we're always talking about love, no? The people that we love. The film is about love. It's about memory. It's about absence. It's about history, it's about politics, but it's a film about love and the loss of love. So that's why I did want to bring up the figures of all these Filipino intellectuals who I love and who have been here, and some of them who have passed, as a way of saying films, art is always about life. No? It's always about life, and it's about how we understand life and how we can understand our own relationships.
Yes. So Richard, the pendulum plays a great part in the proceedings. As in, early on, you know, we see that she knows that Estrella knows that her father is not coming back because he has left the pendulum, and then we see him teaching her how to use the pendulum. What is that pendulum?
I think if you read the book, it's more detailed, no? The relationship between the father and the daughter and how that pendulum plays a part in their relationship. And for me, that's a very intimate part of their relationship. No, I don't think the father shares that object with anyone else, and I think that connects them, you know, on a personal, on a deep level. That in fact in the book, it started as, you know, in a way that she venerated him a lot. You know, she puts him on this kind of pedestal that, you know, that changes, you know, in the middle and towards the end. There are a lot. There's this one article I read about how that pendulum actually creates a sort of tension between them, and it's not like any kind of tension. I think there's this article that says it's a sexual tension. You know, how the dynamic between the father and the I didn't feel it. I didn't feel that while reading it, but somehow there's a level of ambiguity in the film, you know, that connects the two together.
Yes.
And you know, you don't know about
earlier
it. There's a lot of
we talked about the wedding scenes.
Yeah.
There are two wedding scenes that are not there by accident.
Yeah, of course.
And the fact that he's dancing with the daughter after the first communion. Yes, please continue.
Yeah. And remember that dance ended with a shot of the empty chair, right? Like it moves,
that's really good,
it dollies toward. yeah, I mean, I don't understand what it's about, that, but it speaks volumes about their relationship. There's a lot we don't know about, and there's a lot that happens that happens between them that we don't really see. And yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the what makes the film, attractive, because the film doesn't really offer
Mm.
answers to our
Mm.
questions.
Oh,
Although I read the book afterwards, and it's a like I told you, it's a completely different work. There's even incest in the book that
mm.
that the film did not touch on, but it's illuminating in the sense that the book centers on the house a lot. There's a lot of
Yes.
emphasis given on the house, but in the film, I think this is Erice already, the touch of Erice. The films you mentioned earlier, they're not in the book, which makes me think that Erice really thinks cinema is very powerful, on how the art form really affects people's lives. And by adding that kind of signature in his work, it gives you an idea why he makes this kind of films. Maybe to answer, there's this question about why is Erice so important in the history of cinema with only 3 films. It's not about the number of films you make. We see films as chroniclers of history. I think Baby Ruth will agree with me that all filmmakers are documentary filmmakers, in the sense that their works are documents of time. Their works speak a lot about our issues, when they were made, or they are arguments about historical realities. And I think what Erice has made in those 3 films, he was able to make this very strong argument about the role of the role of cinema, in the creation of history, in how we
Yes.
argue about our lives at the present.
Yes. I'd like to ask Baby Ruth, why is El Sur so moving? And yet, you can't, of course, something tragic happens, but even before that, it's so emotional. Its appeal to the emotions is so strong, and yet you don't know exactly what's going on. It's as if it's being enigmatic contributes to its emotional effect. How do you think he achieves this? Why do we feel so much when we don't know? We don't even know exactly what's going on.
Well, that's the thing about the film. It's attractive because the story moves inside your imagination, and it challenges various moral compasses within us. Us as Catholic, as incestuous, maybe in some levels, because we're trying to process the little clues that are being given to us. And I'd like to add something about the pendulum, because the pendulum symbolizes, a window to go inside repressed emotions, and it's a process of going into memories and all those unprocessed feelings that a person cannot go into. But the filmmaker used that symbol to build this very peculiar, very interesting and intimate relationship between a father and a daughter. And it makes you ask questions like, what is going on? And you know that the daughter knows what's going on, or she wants to know, and she wants to dig further. And us as audience are hooked to it, because we want to know more about what Don Agustin is not saying. But he portrays this super creature, this demigod that the women in the film are taking care of, and are whose ego they're massaging his ego in different levels. And also cinema and the pendulum, I'd like to think that they're used in a parallel way, because cinema is, if you think about it, it's like a window that goes to the various emotions of memories, of love, disappearance, internal struggle of people. So for us, we're given all this information and all these emotions that we need to process, and it leaves us hanging. So it wants us to know more. And the ambiguity of sexual tension, how it was used in the film, us as audience, we're natural curious about sex, and the irony between the convention, the religion, and sex. it was also used in the film. That's why we want to know more. We want to choose, which side do we want to go.
Exactly. And there is that scene in the beginning where the father is using the pendulum to find water. And I suppose, it points to how it's about finding secrets, uncovering them, and divining their meaning. Yes.
Yeah,
Sally, you were saying something about magic and belief.
Yes, two things. Each of the things that my co-panelists say are so interesting that they always open up like a huge new discussion we could have. But I always remember that in the beginning, if we divide the film like into three parts, the first when she's a child, the second when she's a teenager, and the third part is the one we've never seen, but we all have in our imagination.
When she goes to the south, yes.
Yeah, but in some way, as a respect for Erice and as intellectuals and artists, we it's like when you're missing a hand, but you still feel it. We know that that part of the film exists, even if it hasn't been made. So in that first part, somebody was writing here, which is really interesting. The pendulum is a symbol of magic, which is obvious. Well, it's magic, but it's also reality because he actually finds water. Zaoris finds water. My mother, who's also a very eccentric English woman, that has a relationship with me, she can send me her thoughts. I can feel her. That's not magic. It's real. I know when she's sending me a message, same as he can feel water. There are things that will be discovered and investigated, or as we know from many indigenous people that we don't know in our Western or non-Western civilization. But there's a moment when she says, something like, I can't find the note, but when she's still a child, she says something like, my father did things that other people believed were miracles, when she's talking about him finding water. And I think it's interesting when Baby Ruth was talking about the idea of film, that in some way, I think that also alludes to what Víctor Erice does with films. Not that he creates miracles, but he does with films what a lot of other people were not doing in Spain in that moment. Okay, so he's with that painterly contrast, with the silences, with the absence, with those tracks, those travelings that Richard was talking about, his way of making film. In a way, it's not a miracle, but it's something that wasn't done. So I think that's also interesting. And I wrote belief because I think that it's true that the pendulum has more power in that first part of the film when she's a child and she still adores her father. But it's not only about magic, it's about belief, because many of these things work when you believe in them. Mm-hmm. I believe that my mother has powers. My father doesn't believe it. So with me, it works. But it works with all of us. So there's a lot about it. There's also about magic, but also belief. Richard, you want to say something?
So
just a brief connection. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Like in the spirit of the beehive, like the film that Anna saw was considered magical. She doesn't know anything about film. It's the first time she saw a film, and when she saw it, with other people, she thought it was really magical. The same way pendulum might have an effect on someone who's like seeing its powers for the first time.
Right, and I wanted to point out that water, of course, is the symbol of emotion, and this uncovering emotions which the father simply does not want to bring up. And speaking of symbols, the viewer, one of our viewers, Dina, is asking about the seagull. What particularly is the role of that seagull, which is how the house is identified because it has that weather vane? Any theories?
For me, clearly, I just say quickly that a seagull is a traveler. No, the seagull is a predator and a traveler. Yeah, and the symbol for the ocean, the seagull, for me, it's another symbol of absence and of desire.
Yes, and of course,
seagulls
are water birds, so water again.
Yeah.
Sorry, Richard?
I don't have anything groundbreaking to say except that it's something related to flight, it's something related to movement. And the fact that that weather vane was used as the cover of the poster, for the poster of the film, I think it says a lot about the direction of the film, in a sense, like how Estrella herself would move away from the house, would find her space, by herself.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah.
The
I'd like to
direction,
add
the wind takes you
also.
where the wind
Baby
takes
Ruth.
Yeah, I mean, I encountered, this reading about seagull and what they represent, and looking into the film and how Erice was trying to, push the boundaries of his freedom into it. Seagull also means, independence, and it has a unique character to be free. It's being used by sailor in different, in different parts of the world as a symbol of being free, and one with the wind, one with, the water, the direction of the water.
Great.
So
Yes, and the
I
viewer
think it has
Christina, yes, our viewer
Mhm.
Christina makes a point about the Caravaggioan, about the use of chiaroscuro and tenebrism. The film looks like it was lit by Caravaggio, who is the cinematographer of this, and is he still working? Sally?
Richard, you want to go? Richard will
No,
talk
no.
first, and then
You go ahead, Sally. No,
well,
Sally, you go ahead.
well, Luis Cuadrado was the cinematographer. He was working with Alcaine, who's a very well-known film director now, who's worked with Almodovar, etc., etc. And as we were saying, Luis Cuadrado is a very, very, very cult filmmaker who worked in many films before of this Nuevo Cine Español, new Spanish film, and he works very, very closely with the idea of light and shadow. And he actually talks about in one of his memoirs how sometimes film captures reality, but sometimes film has to make new realities. And because the conditions were probably often quite precarious, he uses all kinds of film experiments and all kinds of techniques to force that idea of light, the warmth inside. As we all know, Erice's idea was to make the north cooler, colder colors, darker, and then to go to the warmth of the south. And all of this is made by this incredible DOP who is actually losing his sight as we speak. So yes, he's a very
My
important
goodness.
figure, and I would invite all the viewers to look him up and watch all of the films in which he worked in. Carlos Saura with many of these other films. And then going back to Caravaggio, there's references to Caravaggio, but also to Vermeer, to other mannerist painters. And if we talk about films, to Nicholas Ray, to Dreyer, I mean, there's a whole series of filmic and painterly references in the film that you can find by looking at it, reading about it, especially watching it, as Jessica was saying, it's a film that has to be watched at least two or three times, I think.
Yes, and I'd like to ask Richard about a particularly intriguing character who never appears, El Carioco.
Yeah.
The tutor of Estrella. We see his graffiti. We hear his phone call.
The vandal.
We never see him. And then she disparages him. What is he there for?
Yeah. I don't know who he is, but it's interesting because there are a couple of characters in the film whom you don't really see, but you can feel or you can sense, or they have an effect on the character's life. And I think that's what I was talking about when I said, duality, that, cinema is not just about the things you can see, cinema is not just about the on-screen presence, the creation, the projection. It's also about how it manifests behind it, the off-screen presence, etc. And I don't know if he's actually the stepbrother, that we never saw. There's a lot of, even that creates that, feeling of there's a lot we don't know. Maybe to add to what Sally said earlier, with the advent of digital technology, it's hard to see this cinematic quality in films these days. They shot 35mm films in the past, and you can really sense it. For some reason, when I saw the film, I can somehow hear it. I can somehow hear how it cracks. There's that, there's a oral quality to the cinematography. I feel that it's not just visual, but you can also hear it. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
You're
there's
totally
that
making
depth.
sense. Yeah.
There's a depth to its cinematography. Yeah, it's not just visual, you know. It's something that I felt was lost, you know, when we shoot things now in digital, and you know, it's not lamenting about it. It's more of like you can really see the contrast, you know, between the two
Yes.
things.
Yeah,
Highly agree. Yeah.
and I'd like to ask Baby Ruth because so this movie has a lot of relationships with the family, including and with people we don't see, such as the woman in the South, which reminds me that in your film, Sunday Beauty Queens, it's a lot about family, which is the center of Filipino life, and yet your subjects are Filipinos overseas who are separated from their families, and yet live as if their families were with them all the time.
Yeah, I mean, creatively, that was a deliberate decision not to include the families in the film. There was a conversation about it because we interviewed some of the relatives back in the Philippines, but we thought, as Richard, said, that cinema is about capturing the emotions that are not being seen, and it's very important for us to reimagine, these families that were left behind, and using also citing the characters of the father of Don Agustin and also that suitor of Australia. That it's a deliberate decision to make them as absent objects in the film because the film is designed as as Don Agustin is the center, but you can see the women around him. But these men are also very strong characters, and the suitor represents the further sexual awakening of Australia if it's a coming of age film, because it leads to that. Towards the end, we don't know what will happen between the two of them. And as Richard mentioned in the book, that they may be cousins, which that's something surprising. But as a film director, you have to be aware of these decisions because not showing everything actually gives your cinematic language more punch when it comes to the message that you want to send, because viewers would have different interpretation, obviously, about the things that they're not seeing. So that's why this film is very haunting in many levels, because there's another film going on in your mind.
Right.
And the same as Sunday Beauty Queen, we want to we want people to picture these families that they left behind.
Yes.
Where can we watch it? Is it available anywhere?
I can send you the link, Sally, but yes,
good.
it's available online. During this pandemic, we made sure that our overseas Filipino workers can manage to access it. So it's on YouTube. If you search Sunday Beauty Queen, it will give you unprecedented access to it.
Good. I just posted.
And we're being reminded to wrap up. So
okay.
As we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you to for your parting thoughts, any recommendations you can make to the audience as to where they can proceed after watching this wonderful film. Let's start with Sally.
Okay, first quickly, I just posted a link to it's in Spanish, but it's an article about Luis Cuadrado, and there's a paragraph there where he talks about how because talking about you can hear the crackle of the film, it's exactly what he says, Richard, so you were right. It's exactly what he describes about how he makes films. So if you look at that link, although it's in Spanish, I would definitely watch the film of my colleagues, El Silencio de los Otros, which is on Netflix, The Silence of the Others. I would watch, if you haven't seen other of Luis Cuadrado and Erice's film, I would watch them. I would watch Ruth's films, and my film isn't available, the one I made in the Philippines, online yet, because it was recently bought by Museo Reina Sofia, and it's still in some festivals, but hopefully it will be available soon. And I would continue to take part in this really interesting Cineclub.
Thank you. And Richard, I know that there is so much to talk about and so little time. So
I know. I'll make this very quick. So just 3 very small points. Like first, is like geography carries a lot of political history with it. Now, so when you say the South in Spain, it's different from when we say the South here. It has a different connotation. Where we come from and how we are defined by the places we live and move to. It's something very complex, but as solidified in the film, as manifested in the film, we know that, much of it defines who we are and what we are in our futures. Second is that there's a lot of difference between the portrayal of fathers and mothers in cinema. Fathers are often seen as authoritative, mythical, and in control, where our mothers always have to suffer. They always have to sacrifice. And I think,
Totally, very good.
like more than 100 years of cinema, it's about time to really change that, in a way, make that more complex, make that less black and
Very
white.
good, yeah.
And I think it's our, it's our function as academics, as filmmakers, to really steer that direction towards, a more responsible way of making art. And the third one is that, very short, cinema cannot be removed from our present lives. People often think that cinema is an escape, as an entertainment, but whatever kind of cinema you make, it's something that's always rooted in our present, in our lives, in our history.
Totally.
And I think, if there's one filmmaker I can, recommend to people, it's Carlos Saura. I've seen, some of his films, when I was in college, Calmin. If you're into that kind of sensual kind of filmmaking, you might like it.
Yes, and Baby Ruth, any parting words?
I mean, I'd like to say thank you for creating this platform, the Cineclub. For making cinema as a platform for people to discuss and to elevate the conversation about life, about love, about memories, loss, and all the complicated emotions that are attached to living. And it's very important right now, especially that we're moving towards a new era of living, that we have to push cinema as the tool to connect each other. Not just geography, but for us to understand our differences, because those are the things that really divide and complicate our nations, because we don't really understand what's going on at the other side of the world. By watching a simple film like Del Sur, it makes us understand, it makes us connect to various levels of religion, of how families and how drama works internally and externally. So I hope that we can have more of this, and I'd like to take this opportunity as well to promote. We have another talk at 7:00 via the Ang Docu Facebook page. It's also another film called Aswang.
Aswang,
it will
yes.
be moderated.
It's about current events in the Philippines.
And can we
Using
watch
the
the
metaphor
film?
of the monster. Yes.
Yes, we made the film available. I'll check if it's still available, because they have a certain time to watch the film. But the talk is available worldwide, I believe, through the Ang Docu Facebook page, the word that you can see in my background, and also via the Kila Facebook page. It's a very important discussion moderated by Cheche Lazaro and Lourdes Vera. So I'd like you to invite to join us later at 7:00. And thank you, Jessica, for.
I'd like to thank all our panelists. First, Sally in Madrid. I know that we wanted to talk about parallels between the film and the current situation in the Philippines. We're going to have to save that for another Cineclub.
Of course.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Madrid. I hope to see you here in Madrid, all of you, and in the Philippines. And Ruth, email me the information so I can try to join you, okay? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Jessica, you did a wonderful job. Thanks to all of you.
And Richard, are you back in Quezon City?
Yep, I'm back here. Yep. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. And
what happens to your classes when the school year starts?
Yeah, we're obviously shifting to online learning. So I'm trying to get used to how to teach online, which is really hard. But I think that's the way things are now. So yeah, we just have to adjust.
Yes, and thank you very much for joining us. And Baby Ruth, when can we expect another film by Baby Ruth Villarama? Pressure.
We're in production of 2 film projects. One is Inside the Prison, about restorative justice, with the working title Touch the Colors, and also about the ABS-CBN closure. It's entitled Breaking the News, directed by Shara Zambrano. So we're working on that at the moment. But yeah, hopefully we can finish it given the situation right now where we're battling an invisible war at the moment. So yeah, wish us luck.
That's true. Yes, but as Baby Ruth pointed out, cinema is one of the things that brings us together. So in this pandemic, it has never been more vital. So thank you very much to our guests, and thank you to our audience for staying with us in this third episode of Cineclub Película. The movie will be available until 2 a.m. Tonight. So the last full show is at 2 a.m. Do not miss El Sur. Next week, we will be showing the film La Buena Estrella, which is a drama. So thank you very much, and we will see you again next week.